As the landscape of work continues to evolve, remote work has emerged as a fundamental aspect of the software industry. From enhancing productivity to redefining team collaboration, remote work is no longer just a trend. It's the present and the future. In this episode, we will delve into the evolution of remote work in the software sector, its impact on companies and the employees, and the best practices for thriving in a remote environment. We'll discuss the competitive edge that remote work offers to companies and how it is reshaping the industry. Whether you're a software developer, a manager, or someone interested in the future of work, this episode is packed with insights you won't want to miss. Our guest, Nathan Grebowiec, has been leading remote teams for more than 20 years. Before remote was a thing, before COVID, before return to office mandates, he was and continues to be a successful leader of remote teams. Nathan, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So let's start with the very basics. What do you do today for a living, Nathan?
Yeah, sure. So I am a senior engineering manager of a remote team for a startup. So right now I get to wear a lot of hats, is what that means. So I get to have the pleasure of like working with amazing people, solving problems, working like side by side with them, actually implementing solutions to problems, whether that's kind of like idea solutions or actually in the code, deep in the weeds with them on a day-to-day basis. But outside of that, I also then get to kind of like help coach them to hopefully kind of like be the better version of themselves, figure out what it is they want to do. Do they want to go the same trajectory I went and like become a people manager as well? Do they want to go the staff engineer route and become just a person who is a genius about, problem solving in the weeds, doing that? So I get to work with those people that way too. And then of course, like I get to work with people outside my group and kind of help solve problems from the get-go, right? Ideate on those problems that we have. What's the solution we're going to work with product or other people to finally bring those things to those people that I get to work with, day and day to solve those problems. That's kind of that's the 30,000-foot view of what I do on a day-to-day basis.
Lot of work, lot of impact. Sounds very fun.
Yeah, if you're in the startup world, you wear a lot of hats. You kind of accept that, and it's part of the fun and or stress of it you pick. So,
very good. Hopefully more fun than stress. Did you always want to be a software engineer? Tell us your origin story.
Oh man, okay, we're gonna go back into the Wayback Machine here, and it is now the 1980s. We're gonna go that far back. My first experience with computer programming was on an Apple IIe with my brother playing a game called Lemonade Stand. And a lot of the classic games on the old Apple IIes were written in what's called Apple Basic as the programming language they were written in. And you could actually break into them while they were running and change things about them that would then you'd start it back up again, and whatever change you made would be impacted right then and there on what you were seeing. And my brother and I would modify the weather reports in Lemonade Stand. So the game would tell you it was supposed to be rainy that day or it was sunny that day. And we would change it to say things that certain people in my family felt were inappropriate. And so
did they know you were changing that? Your family, did they know you were changing stuff, or were you doing that on the back and they just didn't like what is going on?
So frankly, my stepmom would walk by and see that the weather report now was filled with language that was not appropriate for 7-year-old Nathan. Because we thought it was funny. But like it was, and we got in trouble periodically, but like that was introduction. That was my first moment of being able to see that there was a quick action that could be taken to net a result I wanted. Little did I know at that time in, second and third grade, that it would like feed into this desire in the future to be like, there's a problem and there's something I can do about it, which is like, for me, is the crux of software engineering and like the heart of like wanting to do this job well. But yeah, that was kind of the genesis of it. Kept goofing with it, through high school, ultimately went to college for it. And so it just kind of kept building on top of what started as me thinking cuss words were funny as a 7-year-old.
I love your origin story, man. 7 years old, modifying that must have been fun. And talk about agility, right? When agile wasn't a thing, you were
Right.
doing the shortest sprints ever with the fastest feedback loops ever.
Yeah. And it's something that frankly, so I'm also a father of 2 kids who are in high school now. One's actually about to head off to college, and they both took like an introduction to programming course in school, something that like didn't exist really, right, when I was there. And the part that kind of makes me sad a little bit is that the way things work now, computers have gotten so complex, the expectations of what I do resulting in something like have grown so immensely compared to where I was a kid. Like when I was a kid, making that text change on the screen was sufficient for there to be like, that's cool. That expectation has changed now. There's more, the expectation of a bigger change lives there. So it's like it's harder to have that immediate feedback loop that caused me to fall in love with it. And so that is something I've like frequently thought about. Like, how do you have that fast feedback loop for younger kids to give them that same, oh, this is interesting. I love this. I want an origin story that leads to this. So, yeah.
It's actually a good advice for anyone starting on the software industry, which is, keep that ability to be surprised and to be amazed and to wonder at the magic behind what you're doing, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, at the end of the day, we're making sand think. Like that's what we're doing. We're taking sand, turning it into a computer, and making it think. That's amazing.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah,
so be surprised.
yes. When did you start leading software development teams?
My first experience as a team lead, so not like as a formal manager with some of the additional responsibilities around like performance reviews and all that kind of stuff. Would have occurred kind of in the mid 2000s. I was working for a small team from an engineering perspective. It was inside an organization that was not an engineering company at all. We built handmade furniture, lighting, and textiles. And so I'm in a small engineering group inside of that organization. And we decided to grow some things that we were doing. So I kind of organically got put in the position of leading this team. That was both the best and the worst thing that could have possibly happened to me. It was great from a perspective of opportunity, and beginning to learn like what does it actually mean to lead a team? What does it mean to actually like help people grow themselves? What does it mean to give positive and negative feedback inside of that? But I also did it inside of an area where there was nobody around me who I could lean on. There were no peers in the sense of like an engineering lead or an engineering manager. There were good managers, don't get me wrong, there were good people leading the company, but in very different avenues. So I learned a lot by screwing up because of that, right? There were plenty of opportunities for me to go, well, that was not the best way to do that. That's where it started, and kind of moved through other opportunities from there. Thankfully, in engineering organizations that gave me the opportunity to lean on some people that I've looked at as great coaches. So
I'm going to jump a little bit around here, but
sure.
It's interesting because you forced an amazing career and you have worked remotely most of the time, right? And one of the things people mention as a challenge for leading remote teams is that, or for working in a remote fashion, is that it's hard for you to earn the type of pedigree or to learn the type of lessons that you will learn should you have worked at the office. And you have proved that to be not the case. You were not at the office. You still were forging amazing relationships. You still grew in your career. You still got different opportunities. What will you say to people that say that if you don't work at the office, you are missing out on all of those opportunities? What's your story and your feeling towards that phrase?
Yeah, it's different, no question about it. Being in a office environment does, in my opinion, it forces you a little bit more sometimes into some of those opportunities to work with people and to learn from people, and ultimately to network with some people as well that are going to be important for you later. So one of the key things, and depending on where we go in this conversation, I'm probably going to answer with the same word a lot of the time. At the end of the day, it's about communication, and you have to be the one, especially in a remote environment, to be willing to open those lines of communication with people. Sometimes that is with people that are inside the organization that you're in. Sometimes you luck out, right? And you find yourself in a company that has other people who are peers or direct reports or any of those things that are amazing people that you can leverage. But you have to frequently be the one to reach out, because I don't know if this is like a human nature thing or if this is a little bit more of the people who tend to find themselves in the software engineering industry side of things, but we can get really siloed sometimes as we work a problem. I know this is true for myself as well. Like I have to be cognizant of this fact that sometimes when I'm working a problem, I get in the zone on it, and I shut kind of the world out. And you can, in a remote environment, do that to the nth degree, to the point where it's not just about the problem you're working on at that moment, but it can be other relationships that you start to block out because you're just you think you're doing the right thing. You think you're focused on the problem, you're focused on the solution, and you begin to, all of a sudden it's been 3 days, 4 days, a week, since you've had good connections with other people on your team, whether those are about the problem you're working on at that very moment, or whether they're about more social things that are just about connecting with people at the end of the day. So you have to be willing to take those steps, to introduce yourself to people, to push into people's life to an extent in the remote world that sometimes are offered to you a little more easily in an office environment. But the key thing here is that those opportunities, they exist. They're just different. And so you have to figure out how to exercise those differences. Sometimes, and this is the one that can be really hard for people sometimes, in my opinion, is that it's not about people in your organization. Sometimes you need to find that other body of people that can help you, whether that be groups of peers that are working on a common open source project that you work on. That's actually what was one of the most helpful things to me in that time where I was working for a non-engineering organization. The people that I found that helped me the most to learn weren't people inside the company I was working in. It was people inside of an open source project that kind of acted as that network for me. So you got to be willing to take the moment to discover those things sometimes. And that is on you at the end of the day. You have to take those steps. Sometimes they're not just going to fall in your lap. You have to do it.
That's the key of what I was listening to you, and I was making notes, and the you in this in all of what we're talking about is very, very important. And I think you said it very nicely. The risk is you can operate in silos, right? And it's very easy. It's so easy when you're working remotely to just fall back into your own silo and think you're doing the right things. Mm-hmm. But it falls back on you, and you had a different attitude, and you were reaching out, to people even outside of your organization. And so is that one of the things you work with your teams when you're working with your teams to ensure effective communication and collaboration? Do you remind them that it's on them also to communicate, right? Because you put the onus back on the person themselves, not just waiting to be, you're a leader, you're reaching out, yes, but if your team members are not also doing the same thing, it doesn't work. Will you put it that way?
Yes, very much so. One of my things, anytime people ask me about what's the most important cultural thing in a team that I'm trying to build or a team I'm working with. For me, it's about like an openness and an eagerness to ask questions. Um, and so you have to like get people in a position though where they are comfortable asking those questions, where they feel like they can have that initiative to ask those questions. But like to your point of that question, though, it ultimately it is their job, it's their responsibility to take those steps and do it. Now, having said that, like as a team leader, as an engineering manager, as any position like that, at the end of the day, like you need to set the tone. If you're not setting a tone of that type of openness, of that type of like, that questioning mentality, the people underneath you are never going to act that way as well. So like one of the things that I've personally found to be particularly effective, again, I'm thankful that I've always been in a situation where I'm kind of a little in the weeds as well. So like I'm actively working on solutions to problems as well, not anywhere near as much as like somebody who's doing it like for their entire, responsibility. But I've always got something. And something that I love doing is taking a problem that I'm working on, one that frankly I might not even feel like internally I need help with. Like I might be like, I've got this, I know where I want to run with this. If I have a team member who I think has like knowledge about tool I'm using, platform we're doing, paradigm I'm working under, whatever it might be, I'll bring them in for like a pairing session or something like that and be like, I want feedback on this. What are your thoughts on this? Start probing them, but making it so that it's about me asking them for help as opposed to the other way around, to try and build that kind of like environment where people feel totally comfortable with saying, I need help. I want to ask you. I want to communicate with you. I want to go out that way. You really do have to, again, you got to lead from the front.
I'm taking notes, asking help even if not needed, just to show how open you are to feedback and comments and constructive, um, building on a
And
together on a constructive way. I love it.
and the great thing about it is a lot of times it turns out you don't know everything.
Yeah.
It turns out I have holes in what I know. So even in these things that you're pretty confident about, when you get a different perspective to come in and look at it anyways, you can learn some great things and you can improve what you're doing anyways. So it's self-serving as well at the same point.
I love it. What happens when have you in your career worked with some team members that maybe you see they are going, to the wrong side, to the dark side of force, whatever, right? They are just, going into the silo, and then you're trying different things. What happens there, and how do you take them back if possible? What are the type of conversations you have with them so that they realize that they need to change something as well?
Yeah, that it can be difficult because like people I feel like in engineers, a lot of times you can point out flaws in a solution. Like I can in a PR, I can look at your code and I can say, what if we did this way? And I find that people are a lot more like accepting to that type of feedback in our world. But when it like suddenly shifts and it's not necessarily about your solution to the problem, because they can come back and be like, I offered you a great solution. Now it's more about like their personality a little bit. It's about their way that they're interacting with the team. And it's about those things that are kind of a little bit broader than them. People do get a little bit more defensive about those types of things. And I mean, chief of sinners here. I definitely do that kind of a thing as well. We don't like being called out on things that we kind of view as potentially personal faults. So step one is it kind of goes back to that original conversation of like leading from the front, or that part of like if the first conversation you're having with a person is around that type of a thing, like you've never had any kind of positive or negative feedback for them, and that's the first time that's happening, you're gonna have a hard time. So starting early with your team and with your people of giving them positive, giving them constructive feedback on small things often, like makes it so that if you get to that point where there is that bigger, heavier conversation, it's easier because A, you've had those conversations already, and B, like hopefully they've kind of built some trust with you that like you're not just coming at them for some reason, but like there's an actual like reason that you care about this. And then kind of tangentially to that, I've always been a big fan of making sure people have kind of a big picture view of what's going on. Again, that whole idea we can get into a silo of working on the problem that we have, and like it's kind of weird because sometimes that's actually a good thing. So it's like that weird balancing act of like leaving people alone enough that they can excel at that task while also like getting them out of that box. Um, Giving people that big picture early, being like, okay, you're working on this piece of the puzzle, but like here's how it fits into the grand scheme of things in what we're working on, can help them again get that view of what's going on, so that when you have that conversation of like, hey, we need to ask these questions early, we need to have these conversations, we need to work as a team, we need to pair program, we need to do these things, because it isn't just your part of the puzzle that matters here, it's this whole picture we're trying to paint.
Context, context, and context.
Yep, very important.
What tools and technologies have you found most effective for managing remote teams?
Obviously, we're talking over Zoom right now. Doesn't have to be Zoom. There's plenty of tools that offer this kind of thing. I'm, to the chagrin of some people I've worked with, I'm a really big fan of cameras on. There are some people who absolutely hate that. But like we're people, we're humans, we have multiple senses. Hearing is not my only sense. I want to see you, not because I'm like trying to look over your shoulder and make, and be kind of like a big brother type of thing, but because it's like, as humans, this is part of how we connect. So obviously, things that allow for this type of a communication on a team are fantastic. Conversely, though, like we have amazing things like Slack, that allow for us to do communication in an asynchronous method that can work really well for a lot of people. And this is exceptionally true if we're talking about teams that have like high levels of time zone differences. This face-to-face environment doesn't necessarily work if I'm trying to literally talk to somebody that's on the opposite side of the globe. So being able to have things like Slack that allow for great asynchronous conversations around a problem are highly effective. The other side of it, this might be a 4-letter word to some people, but I'm going to say Jira. Some people hate it, some people love it, some people hate and love it. I'm in that camp. I think I hate and love it both. But like we've got these great tools that allow us to not define work and tell people what the work is, but like prioritize the work and let people know that even in a moment where I might not be directly telling you this is the most important thing and then these are the things that fall under it, like we have tooling now that like makes it really easy for people, whether they're on their phone drinking a cup of coffee waiting for the day to start, or they're in front of their desk like this. They've got ways that they can kind of see what those priorities are and what the expectations are in a really quick and easy way. I hope that answered that question.
Yes, very much, very much. What is a good culture? You talked about the importance of communication. You talked about openness and eagerness. Is that what defines a good culture for a team that is working remotely?
Yeah, I go back to that statement that I said, that one of the key things for me in the culture of a remote team is an openness and an eagerness to ask questions, and to ask those questions early. And like that's true of a non-remote group as well, but I find it like fundamentally important with a remote team. You have to be able to get people to be comfortable communicating around problems and asking questions, because it's really easy to make assumptions sometimes, and you've got a piece of work in front of you. You feel like there's clear acceptance criteria for what you're working on. Like, so you look at it and you go, yeah, I feel like I know where I'm starting, I know where I'm ending, but we can inadvertently make assumptions in the middle of that. And if we're not comfortable asking questions about things as we're working on it, like if we feel like questioning what you've been given is going to lead to some kind of a negative feedback or a negative feeling, you're going to make assumptions, and we're going to get to the end of whatever you're working on, and like that's when we're going to have to fix it. And if we're fixing the problem on this end, like when you're done with what you were doing, we've lost so much time and efficiency in it. Where like if we'd asked that question so much earlier, we could have saved so much time. But like that's an end result. Like that's an end result of a culture. Like you have to have this like feeling of honesty to begin with. Like people have to feel like the conversations that they're having with people are real, like that what the feedback that I'm giving, both positive and negative, like that they believe it and that it's honest. And so you have to have those conversations with people routinely. It can't be, you know, like if let's say you're in an organization that has like biannual performance reviews, that's the only time you're honestly talking with people about the good and the bad. Like you're never going to build that foundation of honesty that leads to them being willing to ask questions early. Um, Another thing that I have that I, again, like leads to that result we want for me is having like an openness to new ideas. I kind of go back to that idea of what I said earlier, where like it turns out I don't know everything. As much as confident as I am that I know everything, it turns out I don't. So having an openness to anybody being able to kind of like propose a new idea, whether that be a solution to an idea, whether that be a way to implement something, whether that be a new paradigm or tool to bring into our like tech stack that we're using. You've got to have an openness to people be able to provide that feedback. And like, you have to be able to give them a way to do it that isn't disruptive to the way the team is working right now. And like, as you do those things, you net that end result of openness, willingness to ask questions quickly. So yeah, that's like in culture. That's what those are the things that matter to me.
I love it. I love it. Does that directly fit directly into the motivation of the team members? So it's hard, right? When you're trying to even say something nice to someone that is close to you, it might be easier in theory. When you're working remotely, it's just, you know, might have a different feeling. But you are trying to keep things honest and you are trying to be open to new ideas and to give room to people to feel like they are part of a bigger thing and that they are contributing. Is that part of how you manage to motivate people that are thousands and thousands of miles away from you?
Yeah. So that's part of what we talked about of the whole context was the expression you used there. Part of the importance of that again is just like to give people a real sense of the importance of what they're doing. Because like frankly, you're not always going to be working on something that feels important. Hopefully the majority of the time there is like a active, like fundamental interest in the problem that's being tackled, but it's not always going to be the case. So you have to be able to give people that context so that no matter where they are, no matter what they're working on at that moment, they see the big picture of what they're doing. But then in terms of like the idea of like how do we make sure that the feedback that we're giving like feels honest when we don't have those day-to-day interactions that sometimes like an in-person thing offers? That's the moment where you do have to figure out how to have kind of the non-corporate interactions with people. I've always been a fan. I'll lean back on Slack here again for a moment. I've always been a fan of having like non-corporate purpose channels inside of Slack, right? Whether it be I see Mario and Yoshi sitting behind you right now, plenty of that behind me as well. Like having environments where people can have conversations about those things they love with other people. I love cooking. So having a Slack channel where I can share something I made, where I can see what other people made, those like little touch points, they're little, like frankly, right? And like on their own, they feel unimportant to like the tasks at hand as it relates to work. But those little touch points over time build into something bigger. And they make it so that when we're having a conversation and I'm telling you something very good that I'm happy about, or I'm telling you something that we need to work on, like having those touch points that have built over time lead to a connection that can kind of like really allow people to accept or reject what you're saying if you haven't done it well.
Very, very nice. Do you have any special way of doing onboarding with remote people? Onboarding is always important, right? And then the image that people are going to get of a company and their coworkers, it's ingrained in those first days. But how do you do it when you're
Yep.
working with remote people?
Yeah, onboarding is both critically important, tough. I guess you can say both because there's three things here. It's critically important, it's tough, and it is so often overlooked. Especially in the like seed round series A startup world, because we got crap to get done. Like that's not where people are investing their time. But like you said, like that is the first interaction that a person's really going to have with the company. Of course, there's the interview process and there's some, connections that are made there, but it's the real like first moment. And but it's not just about the first interactions they're going to have with the people. Like it's about setting a tone of hopefully some level of comfort in the organization. You've got a person who's coming into a new job, and while I'm hopefully they're really excited to get started and work with you, they're probably nervous as well. Like we all, when we come into new situations like that, there's some nerves. And so like onboarding is part of like alleviating some of those nerves. It's about setting the tone. It's about introducing the person to the tech stack and the team. So like it's this really important thing that we frequently, especially in smaller organizations, don't do a really good job of. So, having said all that, they're setting the stage for onboarding. What do I do? First and foremost, like especially if it's a new team, like if you're starting from scratch, you need to document everything that you did to get yourself started. Like every pain point that you went through, every hurdle that you tripped over, every time you had to reach out to another person or organization to get permission to access something, it's like document, document, document. It doesn't have to be pretty. Like that's not the thing. Like, but just like document that process of how you went from I'm just starting here to I can actually take a simple ticket. It's actually a question I ask of some organizations sometimes is if a new engineer started today, how long would it take them to be in a position to do a simple task that actually matters? Like how many days does that take? If somebody comes back and they're like, it takes 2 weeks, way too long. Like it should be a couple days. And the way you do that though, like I said, you put that process together for yourself first. And then you start whittling down at the pain points inside of it. And every time you bring a new engineer on, go through it again. Like they're the most recent person to have gone through it. Talk to them about it after it's happened. Be like, what was hard? What was painful for you? And iterate on that process over and over again. That's kind of like the next thing that a lot of times is dropped is people don't iterate on that process. They'll create it, go, oh, cool, we have a great onboarding document here. It gets you up to speed. It teaches you about X, Y, and Z that our product does. A year later, your product is not doing X, Y, and Z. Your product is doing something different. You're using new technologies. And if you haven't come back and refined that each time it's been touched on, it's now an out-of-date thing that is going to be painful for somebody and give them stress they don't need as a new employee and also not introduce them to what you want to see. So document and iterate.
Document and iterate. I love it. How do you track and measure productivity, and how do you discuss that with the team?
Yeah. So I'll go back to my four-letter word on this one. I'm a big fan of Jira for productivity tracking, mostly because I just want I want people to not just have a picture of what they're working on at that moment and kind of like what the next things are in their priority list. I think it's also really great for them to kind of get a slightly wider picture of their immediate team they're working in to go, oh, I'm working on this right now, but my colleague is also working on this. It gives them a picture, again, a little more context around what's going on. And hopefully for some people, it gives them the opportunity to maybe catch where there's crossover that somebody else might miss. It's easy sometimes to miss some of those points where there's some definite contact points or crossover where people could work together on a thing. And when you have a tool like Jira to see the progress of other people, not just you, in your immediate group, you can leverage and gain some things that way for sure. In terms of like reviewing, then do we in terms of productivity? Like, are you kind of like working on projects fast enough and producing what people expect? It kind of comes back to the same place with a tool like Jira as well, of like set realistic expectations and put them in front of people. That's one of my things that I hate more than anything, is when you don't tell somebody how long you think something should take. Like, if I think something's going to take you a week to accomplish, and I didn't tell you that at the get-go, and all of a sudden we're a week and a half or 2 weeks, and I'm like, what's taking you so long? And I never gave you any clarity at the beginning that a week and a half or 2 weeks is like double the amount of time that I had some expectation on. That's my fault, not yours. So using the tooling that we have to be able to like honestly present from the get-go, like, here's how big I think this thing is. A lot of people like to use the concept of pointing poker. I haven't always been a big fan of that concept. Where you kind of, but you can come in and you can say, I think this is a small thing, a medium thing, a big thing, like things where we kind of paint that picture for people so they have an expectation. Because like, frankly, for myself, if I see something and it's like, this is small in somebody's mind, and I start working on it and I'm like, whoa, no, it's not. Like, I want to be able to have that opportunity to push back and say, hey, we said this is small, but like, here's what I'm encountering. But I like, if there's no clarity of that from the technology that we have to tell you that, like, why would you have that conversation? You're like, yeah, maybe they think it's big too. I'm just going to take the time to deal with it as a big thing.
So very clear, objective, and a platform that becomes the source of truth, right? Because you're seeing everything there, and then very clear expectations being set up, and then conversations around, how are things going, but also how things went based on those conversations that you had.
Yeah. It kind of goes back to that statement I said of one of the most important cultural things is like an openness and a willingness to ask questions. Like, if you've built that, I frequently think about that around the technology, right, and the solutioning, but like here it's about the expectations of how long it should take to do something. If somebody feels comfortable being able to ask those questions, now when I put it in front of you and I say, yeah, I think this should take you about a week. Like, that's kind of my feelings on this because of XYZ. If we built a culture that you're open with, like, you're going to be more willing to push back on that when you disagree with me and say, whoa, no, you didn't think about these side concerns here. Let's deal with those because this is actually going to take longer. Or even frankly, it can be on the converse side where they can be like, no, what are you talking about? That's not going to take that long. That's the best one. It doesn't happen often, but it can.
When you need to give feedback, when you are coming to the end of a sprint or something happens and you need to give feedback, or when you're doing your one-on-ones, etc., how do you do that? Do you leverage Slack? Do you do a call? Do you do it any differently that you will do it if you were together at the office? How do you manage providing feedback to your remote employees?
Yeah. When it comes to direct feedback on like a very specific thing, I'm totally cool with doing that through some kind of asynchronous method, whether that's a comment left on a PR, whether that's a message sent through Slack. For just the way that I normally do things, it's usually on the PR side of things, because it's usually a comment that's attached to some real piece of work that I can highlight and go, I can point at. And say, here's what are we doing here? What are the thoughts on this? Why didn't you consider X, or something of that nature? Again, said this before, I frequently think if we're asking questions at the PR stage, we've asked them way too late. But sometimes that does happen. So I'm totally cool with that. When it comes to feedback around like actual like performance, when it comes to conversations around what does an individual want, right? Those are kind of like career development type questions. I'm not a fan of asynchronous communication for those kind of things. I want to do this. I want to have that face-to-face conversation where we can talk about the good, the bad, and the dreams. So yeah, it can be uncomfortable sometimes. Especially if there's more bad than good sometimes. But I think it's more honest. I think it's more open, it's more direct, and it feeds back into that kind of flywheel of like honesty leading to openness, leading to willing to ask questions. They all play off each other.
Yeah, and it goes back also to what you said about the risk of working in silos. if you're working remotely, you have the the risk of I should get on a call and say all of this, but it's easier I just put some comments there. But you're not helping your culture, right? Everything you just said about culture, you need to have that face-to-face conversation and go the extra mile, right? Go the extra mile, set up that call, have that conversation. I love your mindset.
And it's really important to like lead again, like lead from the front, right? Like if you're the team lead, if you're a senior engineer, if you're an engineering manager, like the burden is on you to set that tone from the beginning. If you don't, like nobody else is going to. And you made the comment there of like setting up those calls. Another thing kind of is important is to sometimes have those touch points, not when they're on your calendar. Like the meeting on the calendar, everybody expects, right? Like let's say you have a team where you're like, oh, we have bi-weekly one-on-ones or something like that. Like everybody knows that's coming. It's sometimes those touch points that come not on the calendar in a positive way, right? Like those are the ones that are really great positive ones, like where you're like, you maybe have an engineer that and this requires you to know your team, right? You got an engineer whose heads down time is from 10 a.m. till 2 p.m. You know, that's their time. They really like to be like focused. Don't reach out to them about something in the middle of that time. Like that's the bad plan. Don't do it. Let them be focused on their moment. But now it's 2:30, you know, they're kind of outside that window where they're normally heads down. Like that's when you can have that be like, hey, I got a question for you. I need help. Or hey, I know you're working on this. Did you think about like, and bringing those little touch points in that are not on a calendar. I hate to say this because it kind of feels like corporate and robotic. Like you're like trying to force like little conversation points that are more organic. And I'm like literally saying plan them, which makes them not organic. I understand the dichotomy of what I'm saying here. But like putting those points in that aren't planned from their perspective can go a long way to building like, again, building that openness and building like, oh, hey, he is reaching out. They do care. They do want my input. They do, you know, they're thinking about me in that sense.
Yeah. What advice would, let's think about someone in our audience that has never led remote teams and now they are being asked to start leading remote teams. What would be your biggest advice for them?
Don't be afraid. It's not scary. You know, at the end of the day, it's still people. If you've managed people before, if you've interacted with people before, if you've cared about people before, like you're still doing that. Like that didn't magically change. But like the ease with which some of those touch points occur is the thing that is suddenly now going to be different. So you do like my last answer there where I said like I'm trying to like force organic things to occur. You do initially for sure. Like you need to be cognizant of those things. You need to plan to reach out to people to make those contact notes. They're gonna get easier. They're gonna eventually. They really will be organic because you've done them so many times. You just have the muscle memory for it. But like yeah, at the end of the day, remember it's still people. Presumably, if you're in a position for people leadership, you're doing it because you actually do care about people and care about motivating people and driving a team. All of that is still the same. Do not worry. All those skills translate. You've just got some new muscle memory to learn.
Agreed. What is the future of work? More remote, less remote? What do you think about that?
Oh man, I wish I had a crystal ball that would answer that question for me because depending on who you ask, it really feels like you get a number of different answers. There's obviously work that will always require consistent physical touch points. You know, if you're working in some kind of like, you know, like the sort of the physical sciences, if you will, kind of hard to do some of that stuff remote. I recognize that fully. But if we kind of like narrow our scope to what we've been talking about in this conversation around software engineering, remote, it's the future, and for me, it's the past as well. But like, it's definitely the future because you have such a talent pool that you can potentially tap into in that scenario. I mean, like Mateo, you and I's first interactions with each other is because of remote work. Like I wouldn't know you and the amazing people you've introduced me to if it weren't for a remote environment and remote work being an honest, not just the result of a pandemic, but like thankfully something that's come out of it is much more recognized, but like because we have the tooling and we have the abilities to do it now. And it's not then just about the talent pool. Like the other thing that is so great about it is like the quality of life that it can offer people that are on the receiving end of it as well. People can have a tendency to have a stronger work-life balance when they're in a remote environment. You're not having to commute. You get so much of your day back in some areas that you live. Like there are just so many positives in front of it. And the negatives that exist are so rarely negatives about remote work and more negatives about people who haven't learned the new muscle memory yet of how to do it. And it's like, if they're open to learning, they'll get there. I'm confident they can. If not, my kids are going to get older and they're just going to be used to it. And they're going to be like, that's how we always did it.
For sure.
Yeah.
You like reading, you like continuous
No.
learning all the time.
Heck yeah.
Are there any books you would like to recommend the audience on the topic of remote work?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, it's not even remote work book specific because I really do believe that so much of what we already know and have already kind of like worked so hard on just so easily applies to remote work when just put through the right lens. So let's say you're somebody who is an engineering manager or ascribing to it. There's a great book called Engineering Management for the Rest of Us. It's actually a pretty new book. I think it was only published 2-3 years ago, something like that, if I'm thinking correctly. So it has kind of this mentality of remote work already baked in as a reality. And it is like working around like tooling and things that we're already doing in the industry right now. But it does a really great job of introducing kind of the human side of the problem to people who maybe haven't always been thinking about the human side of it. Maybe you're somebody who's been a team lead or a senior software engineer, and you're like, I think this might be something I want to pursue. It's a great introduction to it to see like what does that mean to actually to manage people and to care about them, and what would that possibly look like in your day-to-day life. It's a great book to kind of like, if you're not doing it yet, see what it might look like, and if you are doing it, go, I didn't think about some of those things, and hopefully incorporate some good practices into your life. Outside of that, my other favorite ones are really just some of the classics of software engineering. The Pragmatic Programmer, Clean Code, Extreme Programming Explained. Like these are some books that have been around for a while, and they're not about managing people. They're about paradigms that we can apply to our software engineering craft. And I'm not like dogmatic about like certain principles. I'm not going to be one who's going to walk in here and say, I mentioned Extreme Programming Explained. I'm not somebody who's going to be like, everything in this book, do this. I'm more of grab a couple things from each type person. And when you suddenly shift into the leadership role, it's like less about how am I going to employ these things that I love? One of the mantras of extreme programming is getting a product in front of people as fast as possible so you can iterate on what they're telling you as opposed to your assumptions. So like, how do I take that and apply it to my team now? How do I get my team to agree with and love that idea and then execute on it?
Very, very good. If you're listening right now, you might just want to go back, replay, and take note of all of those great books that Nathan was recommending. One final question to you, Nathan. What do you do when you are not working?
When I'm not working, so a mixture of things. I'm a happy father of two, so I follow my kids to many activities that they love. Whether that be volleyball or golf or things of that nature. But outside of that, for myself, I'm a child of the 80s, as was mentioned in my origin story, and I forgot to grow up. So I still play video games routinely. I love the problem solving and the immersion they bring to the table. But then I also love getting outdoors. Big fan of hiking in the mountains. The Rocky Mountains are only about 4.5 miles or 4.5 miles, 4.5 hours away from me. I wish they were 4 miles away some days. So I love hiking in the summer. And then I'm a really bad long distance runner. So I love running long distances slowly. So
It's
those are my go-tos.
I feel the same way. We're very close in that. Nathan, this was great. Thank you so much for sharing so much insight on your experience leading remote teams. I appreciate it, and I hope that we can get together sometime again in the future and talk about this or any other topic that you would like to talk about.
100%. I appreciate the opportunity. It's been a blast.